is using multiple drives that will give you the flexibility that if a drive fails, because it's in a RAID of other drives, your data still goes, works, is accessible, and then you have X number of days to swap out that bad drive for a new good drive, and then your RAID's at full features again. So that's something that you need to make sure that your server has the right level of RAID in the drives to give you the redundancy you want. But then on your workstations, most people never bother putting RAID on their workstation, because if their workstation fails, they're going to get a new workstation, because it's only affecting them, not an entire office of 5 users or 100 users or 500 users.
Yep, good point on that, Kevin. The things I'm seeing RAIDs obviously agreed is on the server and then also on the NAS, or the network attached storage. And I'm also a big fan of, hard disks have always been one of those things that fail more so than other items because it's a moving part. So if you've got a mirrored drive, or in the case of a RAID 5, you have a series of drives that you're striped with a parity drive, you can have a failure and it does not let you lose your data. You simply pop out the bad drive, plug in the new one, it goes back, updates the RAID, and you're able to continue without any downtime.
And that's the power of RAID. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten a note from a customer saying we had a drive fail, but we're okay because RAID's in effect. Can you send somebody out here to get ready to swap out the drive? Or they tell us we're swapping out a drive because RAID kicked in and showed us that we had a failed drive. And
hopefully they know to not ignore the beeping noise. I've had one client that's like, I have this annoying noise coming from my server. And finally went and looked at it and said, oh, well, you've got a bad drive in your RAID. If you lose another one, you're going to be out of luck. One other point on RAID real quick is when you buy disks, a lot of times they're made from the same manufacturing run, and a lot of times their mean time between failure is actually about the same time. So it always makes me kind of get worried when one fails, you might have a whole series of failures coming up after that.
Correct. And in today's environment as well, is as we see more and more solid state drives, we have more comfort knowing that because it's not a mechanical moving part, there is less to break. So hopefully that drive will last much longer than a normal old-fashioned spindle drive.
Agreed. And the space capacity on these SSDs is going up dramatically, which is really nice to see. All right. Why don't we cover a little bit of the recovery testing? You want to cover what you think are some of the best practices?
When I see recovery testing, what immediately comes back to mind is where we started, data backup policies and procedures. And the recovery testing is so important to make sure that somebody is going to make sure that what is being backed up really is being backed up. When I'm working with outside IT firms, I'm always making sure that I tell them as we're implementing different items on servers or applications, you need to test the recovery by doing a restore. I don't want to hear someone say, oh yeah, it works. I want someone to say, I tested it and it worked.
I completely agree with that. I've had way too many times where somebody says, oh yeah, I'm confident it works. But until you actually do that recovery, you don't have the validation that you really need.
Correct. And there are a lot of IT people in the workforce that I'll say can get a little flippant sometime, where they just say, oh yeah, it'll work. And they think just because they said it will work, that it actually does for certain work. And that's what recovery testing is all about.
It's one of the things you want to find out in a safe test environment, not when you actually have a critical loss, that you're able to retrieve what you need. There's a funny cartoon I've kept on my bulletin board for a long time of a guy who's wheeling up this big giant crate, and it says, warning wild rhino, and they're going to open up the server room and say, let's test how well the disaster system really works.
I like that. That's cute.
A couple of the thoughts I have on recovery testing is, again, it's a different level. So do you test at the individual file level? Can you restore folders? Can you restore servers? Or even sometimes network configs have their own issue with Active Directory and other things like that.
That's a great point, is each of those 4 items that you just mentioned are all individual subtests within that recovery testing that you need to make certain that you're comfortable works, especially as you start getting to, well, if I lose an entire server, can I truly restore it back to its state that it needs to be?
And again, that gets back to how much are you willing to spend to be down or not be down. All right, how about a little bit the subject area relating to controls over backup data? Some of the things that I look at when I'm doing some of the reviews is it's how much protection do you put on the backups themselves? Do you keep them encrypted? What's the chain of custody for them? How do you make sure that if you have sensitive data that it's properly kept in the right controls, but at the same point not so restrictive that you can't do what you need to do from a backup standpoint?
Correct. If you layer into that whole scenario the fact that are you HIPAA compliant or whatever other regulatory agency is putting down certain edicts of how your data needs to be backed up and saved and where it's saved and what format it is, that's also important. Almost every one of us now in a business environment come through and touch some type of data that's either fiscally or from a credit card standpoint needs to be encrypted, or it's some type of healthcare or HIPAA type documents or information that needs to be saved and encrypted correctly. So we just can't say, I have a backup. We also have to make sure that the controls are all there based on whatever agency is overseeing us.
Yep, great point. So especially, how is your cloud transfer? Is that encrypted properly? And is the facility that you're using to receive that backup, is that meeting the requirements that you need? And are you looking at their SOC reports to make sure that they're doing things that they say they're going to do if you're using a third party?
Correct. And getting into those SOC reports is so much more important today than it was years ago, because those SOC reports are giving you as a reader a third party's opinion on if your vendor is doing all the things that need to be done day in, day out, year in, year out, not just what's on the marketing on their website, but in real life.
Right, and especially since we're using so many third parties for backups and services, as we mentioned, the Carbonite and the OneDrive, and those are all third party. So looking at what they're doing is important because you're placing reliance for your own data on them.
Correct. It's I'm amazed how many people years ago would lock all their paper filing cabinets, etc., when they left the office at night. But you look at the amount of data that they're leaving on their PCs with their PCs turned on, or what they have backed up on a USB drive sitting next to their desk that is last night's backup from the cloud. And all that data is so accessible versus years ago, the data was not. So you really need to make sure you're putting in the controls that your management team's expecting.
That's a good point. It's always that weakest link in the chain that can be the problem. And now that, things are propagated so much, you have to really expand your scope when you're looking at things. Well, Kevin, any other kind of good backup stories you can think of? I always find stories are interesting to share.
I'm old enough and have had enough fun that I've had tapes that have broken or come off the spindles that we had to hand wind back on to another cassette so we could restore items. The hard drives that have crashed over the years that you had to send out and pay thousands of dollars for some type of data recovery or sector recovery of different items. All those stories are fun to have, and I think the stories of the future is going to be more of what's going to happen to all this cloud storage that's out there of all of our data if people don't do a good job of purging data out of the systems that they're backing up onto, because we're all generating just so much electronic noise or exhaust that's just data that's really not important after so many days or so many months, but it still exists and no one's getting rid of it.
That's probably data pollution. That could be our next big issue. But I agree with that. I look back at, how many versions of something are being stored and which one is the correct version of what you need. And as this stuff grows, it gets harder and harder to maintain. It's going to become a real issue. I appreciate everybody's time, and on behalf of the AICPA Information Management and Technology Assurance Division, we would like to thank you for tuning in to this CITP Exam Series podcast on data backup and recovery. This is one in a series of podcasts that the AICPA's IMTA division is pleased to offer around a variety of topics of importance for the CITP exam. Be sure to check out other podcasts in this series on topics that include data analysis, reporting infrastructures, COSO framework, information lifecycle management, service organization controls or SOC, internal audit, PCI compliance, and HIPAA compliance. Thanks for listening.